In the middle of the most destructive war humanity had ever seen, an even bigger threat was quietly taking shape. A secret race was on, a race to build a weapon that could end the war. Or maybe the world. The fate of that race and of everyone in it would come down to two men. One was a gruff, no-nonsense general who had just rammed the Pentagon to completion with terrifying efficiency. He was a man of iron will, a master of logistics who saw the world in deadlines and results. The other was a brilliant, tormented physicist, a reader of ancient Sanskrit poetry, who was more comfortable with abstract theory than managing a university department. And somehow their unlikely volatile partnership was destined to change the world forever. They were a study in contrasts, an alliance of oil and water, of pure pragmatism and pure theory. This is the story of the feud that forged the atomic bomb. By 1942, the Manhattan Project was a sprawling, disorganized mess. Research was scattered across the country, progress was crawling, and the fear that Nazi Germany would build a bomb first was a constant, terrifying shadow. The project didn't just need a leader, it needed a force of nature. Enter Colonel Leslie Groves. Soon to be General Groves, he was a man who got things done. One of his own men described him as the biggest SOB I have ever worked for, but also admitted that if he had to do it all over again, he'd pick Groves every time. Groves was demanding, abrasive, and relentlessly driven. His last job was overseeing the construction of the Pentagon, a Herculean task that cemented his reputation as a master builder. He was hoping his next assignment would be a combat command overseas. Instead, he was handed a project so secret it sounded like science fiction. He was told to build an atomic bomb. Groves, the ultimate pragmatist, immediately saw the project's biggest flaw. It had no central scientific mind to actually design the weapon. He needed a scientific director. He met with the top physicists of the day, Nobel laureates, titans of the field. But then he met a man with no Nobel Prize, barely any administrative experience, and a security file overflowing with red flags. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist from Berkeley, famous for his lightning-quick mind and a charismatic, almost hypnotic personality. He was also a walking paradox. A chain-smoking intellectual who dabbled in mysticism, a man whose closest associates, including his own brother and his wife, were known communists. By every standard of military security, he should have been untouchable. Why did Groves choose him? Why did this by-the-book general stake the entire project and his career on such a wild card? Many were baffled, but Groves saw something the security file missed: an overweening ambition. He saw a man who, beneath the poetry and philosophy, was desperate for a challenge that could match his intellect. Years later, when asked why Groves picked him, Oppenheimer simply said the general had a fatal weakness for good men. Another physicist called the choice a real stroke of genius on the part of General Groves, who was not generally considered to be a genius. Groves personally waived the security requirements, taking full responsibility for his choice. The most important partnership of the 20th century had begun. Groves' first task was to give Oppenheimer a place to work. But Oppenheimer didn't just need a lab, he needed a secret city. The location had to be isolated for security and safety. After touring a few potential sites, Oppenheimer, who loved the New Mexico landscape, suggested a remote boys' school on a dusty mesa. Groves took one look and said, "This is the place." Within days, the army began acquiring over 50,000 acres of land. This was Groves' world. Just as he'd commanded the concrete and steel of the Pentagon, he now commanded the creation of Los Alamos. It was a logistical miracle. Barracks, laboratories, and workshops rose from the dirt with shocking speed. Groves wasn't just in charge of Los Alamos, but also the massive industrial sites at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, which would produce the raw fuel for the bomb. It was an entire empire of science and industry, all under his absolute command. But inside the fences of Los Alamos, a very different kind of problem was brewing. Oppenheimer wasn't building with steel, he was building with minds. He recruited a team that's been called the greatest collection of scientific intellects in history. Nobel laureates and brilliant young physicists from all over the world answered his call. They arrived in a muddy, chaotic construction site to find a world run by military rules. Groves' initial plan was what you'd expect from a military man. Put the scientists in uniform and have them follow a strict chain of command. The scientists flat out refused. They argued that science doesn't work that way. It needs open debate, collaboration, and the freedom to question everything. This was the first real clash between the general and the genius. Oppenheimer, the supposedly sensitive academic, became a fierce defender of his scientists. He went head-to-head with Groves, arguing that the only way to succeed was to let the scientists be scientists. Groves, to his credit, gave in. The lab would be a civilian operation run by the University of California. It was a huge concession. Oppenheimer had won, establishing a culture of intense, round-the-clock collaboration that he personally nurtured. He brought out the best in us, his colleague Hans Bethe later said. The partnership worked, but it was never easy. At their core, they were just two fundamentally different men. Groves was the driver, obsessed with security and deadlines. Oppenheimer was the creator, focused on intellectual freedom and scientific discovery. Their personalities were in constant conflict. Groves saw the scientists as temperamental people who had to be managed. He couldn't understand why they needed to debate abstract ideas when there was a bomb to build. He enforced strict compartmentalization, a military tactic where each group only knows what's necessary for their specific job to stop any one person from seeing the whole picture. Oppenheimer fought this at every turn. He insisted that the problems they were facing were so complex that they required the free exchange of ideas. He started holding colloquia where everyone from top physicists to junior technicians could brainstorm together. This drove Groves' security team crazy. But Oppenheimer, leaning on his immense intellectual authority, usually got his way. Their entire relationship was a power struggle. Groves was by title the supreme commander of the project, but at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer was the unquestioned leader of the group. Groves learned to handle Oppenheimer like a priceless, temperamental instrument. And Oppenheimer, who could be famously arrogant with other academics, was always patient and respectful with Groves, carefully explaining the mind-bending science. They found a strange, functional respect for one another. Each man knew deep down that he couldn't succeed without the other. Groves provided the unstoppable momentum and limitless resources. He literally and bureaucratically moved mountains to get his scientists what they needed. Oppenheimer provided the intellectual fire, channeling the chaotic energy of hundreds of brilliant minds toward a single, terrifying goal. That tension between them was about to be tested by a devastating scientific crisis. The project was chasing two different paths to a bomb. The first was a fairly simple gun design, which would fire one piece of enriched uranium into another to create a critical mass. This was for the uranium bomb, Little Boy. The second, much more complicated path was for the plutonium bomb. Plutonium was, in some ways, easier to produce on an industrial scale, but early tests revealed a catastrophic flaw. The particular type of plutonium they were creating was so unstable it would pre-detonate, fizzling out before a full nuclear explosion could happen. The gun design wouldn't work. This wasn't just a setback. It was a potential disaster. Billions of dollars and years of work were on the line. The entire massive facility at Hanford was being built just to produce plutonium. If they couldn't make a bomb out of it, the whole project could fail. It was in this crisis that the strange genius of the Groves-Oppenheimer partnership truly shone. Groves, the pragmatist, didn't care about scientific elegance. He cared about results. He put incredible pressure on Oppenheimer and his team to find a solution, and fast. The solution was a radical, unproven theory called implosion. The idea was to surround a sphere of plutonium with conventional explosives, all perfectly shaped into lenses. These lenses would have to detonate with absolute symmetry at the exact same microsecond, creating an inward shockwave that would crush the plutonium core into a critical mass. The engineering challenge was staggering, like trying to crush a beer can into a perfect smaller sphere from all sides at once. Many scientists thought it was impossible. But Oppenheimer, using his unique gift for inspiring and directing his team, threw the full weight of Los Alamos behind the problem. He created new divisions, brought in more experts, and fostered an atmosphere of desperate innovation. Groves, for his part, delivered the resources and kept the relentless pressure on. The feud between military order and scientific chaos transformed into a powerful synergy. The general demanded the impossible, and the genius found a way to deliver it. By July 1945, they had a device. They called it the Gadget. In the pre-dawn darkness of the New Mexico desert, at a site codenamed Trinity, the world's first atomic bomb sat atop a 100-foot steel tower. The tension was unbearable. The weather was terrible, threatening to delay the test. Oppenheimer was a nervous wreck, gaunt and chain-smoking constantly. Groves was outwardly calm but inwardly terrified that his $2 billion gamble was about to become the world's most expensive dud. Every time Oppenheimer seemed about to crack, Groves would pull him aside, walk with him, and steady him. Despite all their conflicts in this final moment, the general was there for his genius. At 5:29 a.m., the bomb detonated. The result was beyond anything they had ever imagined. A flash of light brighter than a dozen suns, followed by a shockwave that knocked men off their feet miles away. A terrifyingly beautiful purple and orange fireball rose from the desert floor, morphing into that iconic, terrifying mushroom cloud. Grove's first thought was one of pure relief. The war's over. Oppenheimer's was far more poetic and far more chilling. As he watched the awesome, terrible power he had helped create, a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, flashed in his mind. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The feud was over. The partnership had succeeded. Weeks later, the bombs they built were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war came to an end. In the years that followed, their paths split dramatically. General Groves, the man who drove the project to completion, was largely overlooked for other high-profile commands and faded into a corporate career, his contributions overshadowed. Oppenheimer became the most famous scientist in the world, a revered and tragic figure who would later be stripped of his security clearance in a humiliating public hearing. But their legacy is forever entwined in the fire of that first atomic blast. They were the oddest of couples, the blunt, demanding soldier and the sensitive, brilliant academic. Theirs was a relationship born of necessity, forged in conflict and defined by a common, world-altering goal. They were the general and the genius, the unlikely pair who, through their friction and their grudging respect, gave humanity the power to save itself and to destroy itself, all in a single blinding flash.